Make sure everything's working. All right, we are live now on Facebook and our YouTube channel, Herc Tallahassee. I want to encourage people to send questions, comments into the comment section under the videos, and Barbara and Stacy will be able to view them and ask as they come in. So take it away, Stacy.
Great. I'm going to hand it over to Barbara. I'm just so pleased to be here on behalf of Searching for Identity. And I just love the partnership we are doing with Holocaust Education Resource Council in Tallahassee. So Barbara, I'm going to hand it over to you to do the introductions.
Thank you very much, Stacy. I want to welcome everybody here today for our third Facebook Live with Searching for Identity and Herc. But today we have three special people joining us, and today our featuring is children of Holocaust survivors, otherwise known as the second gen. And Stacy is such a world of knowledge working with second gen that this is the time that we can learn from keeping the stories going. So I want to welcome Rita Blank and Elizabeth George and Steve Friedlander, all of living in Tallahassee and our local community here. And I'm going to turn it over to Stacy now to start some really good conversation of why we need to remember the Holocaust in our family stories.
Thank you, Barbara. I also think it's important for your audience to know that, Barbara, you too are a second gen. And everyone that you see on this screen is doing everything in their power to capture these stories because they're so incredibly important. So what I'd like to do first is hand it over to Elizabeth. And Elizabeth, if you could just give us a very brief sketch of how your parents survived the war, and then we'll go ahead on to Rita and then Steve.
Sure. Hi. Thanks for asking me to be here. Both my parents are from Hungary, different parts of Hungary, and they're 10 years apart. So that right there says something, because my father was from a small town near Romania. And in 1944, he and his family and many of the people in the village were transported by train, eventually going to Auschwitz. My mother lived in the big city of Budapest. She was only 5-6 years old, and they put all the Jews in the ghetto. And so she remained into the ghetto until the Russians came in and liberated them in the spring of 45. Whereas my father was sent off to the concentration camp in the spring of 1944. Being a child, my mother just obeyed what my grandmother told her to do. Be quiet, don't say anything. If the Gestapos came in, hide in the furniture. So she learned to hide in the furniture and be very, very quiet. And the one thing that I did learn from my mother that transferred to me was that always know where your things are. Make sure your things are in its place, because if you have to go in a minute, you have to know where your things are. You can't go, where are my keys, or where are my shoes, or where's my purse? Everything belongs in its place, so that if you have to leave in an instant, like she had to, you have to know where your things are so that you can gather it and move on. I thought as a child, she was just a clean freak. Everything has to be in its place. But I realized that this was a behavior that she had and learned being in the Holocaust and being in the war. My father, he was transported to Auschwitz. He worked in the labor camps there, and he was on the death march when everybody was leaving Auschwitz, and then woke up one morning in the woods and found the American soldiers coming down the street. So he knew, okay, it was over. And I didn't know as a young child what the numbers on his arm meant.
Okay, we'll come back to that in a second, because that's incredibly important and where we're going next. And Elizabeth,
okay.
Any second gen that are listening with us this afternoon, what you said probably truly resonates, this idea of being ready to go. There's actually a theory, something called about, having that suitcase packed.
Yes. So and I actually do have a suitcase that in case there's something going on, here's my Rubbermaid container with everything that I need in it to survive out of my car. Kind of like a hurricane kit,
Sure.
as we would call that.
Right, right. So it's real. It's real.
Right. Now with my father, the one thing that I saw passed down with him of behavior is he would say to me, I don't trust anyone. He never trusted anyone. And so I had to learn how to trust. But also he said, don't take no for an answer. If you don't like what someone tells you, ask somebody else, but don't take no for an answer. And I think that persistence and that resilience and that stubbornness of him got him, allowed him to survive, because he was that, he had that tenacity to keep going, keep going, keep going. And
Well,
so
I can
he
feel that
instilled that.
energy. I can feel that energy radiating from you. That's beautiful. It really is. Thank you, Rita.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.
This is hard in a couple minutes to tell two stories, but I will do my best. And thank you so much for asking me to be here today, Barbara. My mom and dad were both from Poland. My dad from Warsaw, the capital, where there were so many Jewish people before the war that engaged in all types of professions. My father was, I don't know how to say, but strong. And then after the war, I would say he kind of kept his emotions in check. I think that was part of his way of being strong, and the way he was able to survive past the war. He had two sisters and one brother that he lost during the war, and his parents. They were all taken into the Warsaw Ghetto and rounded up. And eventually my father did fight back in the uprising and was one of the last few men taken from the ghetto to Auschwitz, where he was there for, I believe, about a year. He met someone there named Felix, who later would become his brother-in-law, that they survived together. I hear that if you are with somebody you can trust, there's that trust issue, Elizabeth, that helped you to make it through the day. And they were liberated from Auschwitz. My mom was from a small town in Poland, Pińczów. There were, I believe, 6 children in her family, and her mother, after her brother and father had already been taken away by the Germans, her mother thought that she and her sister would have the best chance of survival of the other children, sent them to the woods, and they survived there for a little while. They were later picked up and taken to several work camps and different concentration camps. I believe at the end they were, maybe not, but they were in Kaufering and also in Bergen-Belsen. They would both tell you that they survived because they had each other, that they wanted to take care of each other. They were both really sick at different times, and made it because they had each other. And later, after the war, in the displaced persons camp, they met their husbands. And my dad was with Felix, who my mother's sister ended up marrying. And they were all, after the war, went to Columbia, South Carolina, where Beth Shalom Synagogue sponsored them. Actually, the whole synagogue sponsored them and helped them to relocate there and set up their new lives.
Rita, the displaced persons camp?
Oh, I'm sorry, I don't know that name offhand.
That's okay. Thank you. Thank you. Steve.
Good afternoon, and my story is a little different than Elizabeth's and Rita's in that my father was not in a concentration camp directly, though he had an uncle and his father. So my grandfather and great uncle did spend some time in a concentration camp. So my story is a little bit different, and there are many stories to tell about the family's exit from Germany. My paternal grandfather was actually a decorated German World War I veteran. He fought in World War I on the German side. He was a sharpshooter. In fact, he was so good that the commander gave him some time off because he was that good. And then after the war, the family lived in Brieg, Germany, which at the time was in the extreme southeast corner of Germany. It's now part of Poland. After the partition, after World War II, it became part of Poland. So it's actually in the southwest corner of Poland. In fact, when Barbara and I were in Poland 4 summers ago, we were within, I think, about 75 kilometers of Brieg. So I was tempted to go there, but I would have missed the Auschwitz day. I said, that's not happening. But my grandfather, after World War I, was a businessman, and made a living in Brieg. And then my grandmother's brother, Kurt Bach, was also a businessman. Those are the two who spent time, I believe it was Buchenwald. They spent some time in a concentration camp. My uncle for 3 months. In fact, when I was a student at Florida State, in between my freshman and sophomore years, I took a Holocaust class under Dr. Richard Rubenstein, who Barbara just only passed away very recently. But he was an eminent scholar on the Holocaust, and I asked him, what would I do to help him out? And we discussed that. So, I've got an uncle and a father, and they can write letters, and he was very receptive to that. So my uncle wrote a letter about his experience in the concentration camp. And I don't know if Barbara, if you have a copy of that, but I can get copies made. I still have that. And then he was actually the one, my uncle, going fast forwarding, who advanced to Shanghai from Germany, because my family went through Shanghai, and did what it took, AKA bribery, to get the family from Germany to Shanghai. My grandfather spent more than a year at Buchenwald. And when he came out of the camp, as my father said, he was a broken man. He never worked again. He was not able to work. This is a very able person. And then eventually, to make a very long story short, he was a stubborn man too, by the way, because he was going to stay in Germany no matter what. And then the Nazi officer showed him a list of the next family who was going to be shipped out. And their family was on the top of the list. So they took the hint finally, and got on the train and went through Germany, took the Siberian Express, and then on to Shanghai. That's the very short version of a long story.
Right. And I hope that people viewing today can understand that what we're looking at here are 3 incredibly brave, strong individuals who are standing as testimony for their parents' story because their parents can't anymore. And they have these are second gen who have chosen the responsibility to make sure that these stories are captured and shared for history, for personal reasons, and clearly for no one to deny. The second gen identity is remarkably strong and resilient, particularly in the profiles you're looking at right now, because these individuals are willing to share. But it goes back to, if we want to kind of peel the layers of the onion, it's the idea, let's go back to survivorship and what does that mean? And in the case of Elizabeth, and in the case of Rita's legacy, they have family members who have tattoos. The scholarship that speaks to the Holocaust and symbolism points to certain images that we all conjure in our brains. A lot of times that is the image of Auschwitz, and a lot of times it is the tattoo. And that ends up being equated with identity. So I'm very curious to hear from Rita, and then we can go right to Elizabeth, on what was it like to grow up seeing that tattoo? And how did that affect what you thought of your parents, and what you thought about yourselves. And then we'll go ahead again over to Stephen, who can talk about survivorship without a tattoo, number one, which is the majority of survivors. And secondly, the Shanghai experience, which, Steve, am I correct? Most people don't even know about it.
No, they don't.
Right.
They don't.
Right. So Rita, could you talk about that tattoo?
Yes. First, I'll say that my parents really did not speak very much of the Holocaust while we were growing up. I have a younger brother. I think they wanted to do as best as they could to put the past behind them and to carry on and to build good lives for us. I don't remember exactly when I knew that they were survivors. I did know my dad had that tattoo on his arm. I knew that we were different in our family because there were no grandparents, and there was my mother's sister and her husband that lived in Colombia. So we had a small family, and it was just something. It was a mark there on my dad. But probably until I was maybe in high school, I didn't really know that much about the war, any of their experiences, or maybe even why he had that on his arm. They were just very, very quiet about that. I know my aunt did tell her children more about her experiences, but my parents were really very quiet about it. I did find out when I was, I think I was about 30 years old. They went to Washington, D.C., where there was a big convention of survivors from all over the world. And when they came back, they were interviewed, and there was a story in the newspaper. And that was when I actually read my mother's story. My father's story, I found out even much later than that. So we have to really appreciate when survivors speak out, because it's not easy. And it's really very, it's nothing like hearing a survivor story for students in the classroom, or for adults too that are wanting to learn more about the Holocaust.
So Rita, tattoo, what does that mean?
It means that my dad was strong beyond what I could imagine. He marched in the death march. I know his times were awful in Auschwitz, which we know is one of the worst camps of all of them. But he was strong. He had a dedication to survive. He wanted to live, and his Judaism was very, very special and very, very important to him. Even in his later years, when he was not in the best of health, he was always at Saturday morning services in the synagogue.
So it seems to me what you're saying is, you look, that tattoo, those numbers equate to strength.
Yes, it does. Even though maybe not strength that you would see every day, but inside, I know that was a big part of him and his willingness to survive every day.
Thank you. Thank you, Rita. Elizabeth.
Hi. Well, first of all, I want to say that when my father just passed away in November of 2019. And right before that, when the physicians in the hospital and the nurses in the hospital would see the number,
yeah,
they were all like he was a rare swan in a duck pond. They'd never experienced seeing that. It was almost like, oh, wow, it really did happen. There's one of them right there in bed. And wow, it's like a badge of honor, a badge of strength. This man has tenacity, and this man is amazing that he survived that. So, and let me go back to when I realized about his arm. My father was a baker. Okay. When he came to this country, he chose that profession. When he was in a DP camp, he was in a DP camp in called, I can't even say it because it's a German name. Anyway, I'm trying to figure out what his DP camp is. It sounds like Wolf something, Wolf Frathauser, something like that. Anyway, he was a mechanic there, and he wanted to be a mechanic when he came to this country, but instead he fell into baking and he became a very successful baker. And so when he was rolling out the dough, I would always stand next to him and I would see the numbers on his arms and I'd say, Daddy, what is that? And he'd say, oh, I got that in camp. And I just thought it was a tattoo that he got in camp. And it didn't come out really the whole story until the movie Sophie's Choice came out. When that movie came out, then he said to me, do you know how it happened in the movie? Did you see it? That's what happened to me. And then slowly, the story started pouring out. And of course, I was much older then, as opposed to a little girl standing next to him, watching him roll out the dough. And so I could understand. I was more of a mature age where I could understand his stories. And he really referred back to that movie a lot. Do you remember when the train did this? Well, this happened in my family. And so I took that as really his numbers was a badge of honor. Look what I went through and I lived to tell about it. And he would say to me, they could take away my name because I was no longer a name anymore. I was a number. They could take away my clothes. They took away my family, but they can never take away what's up in here, my education. And that's why education in our family was very, very important. So much so that I became a teacher. And so that he said, that's the one thing nobody can steal from you is what's up here. So for me, those numbers, it wasn't so much the pain behind it. It was more of his strength that he survived it. So that's how I view it.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And you give me such a great visual of this little girl watching her father roll out the flour, and then you're seeing, you know, the light catch this number. And what you're doing, as both you and Rita are commenting on what the number represents, it almost feels like you're taking a flag and you are putting down your ownership on what was a victimhood, and indeed it is, but saying, you know what, the legacy will not live like that. There's another chapter, and that chapter has to do with honor and strength. And I just
Right.
love that. I love that.
And we did not want Hitler to win. We did not want the war to win. We wanted to say that we persevered. We have children, we have grandchildren, we have great-grandchildren. And so the legacy lives on. And so Hitler did not win in that respect.
I think that probably made our parents the most proud, is after the war to say they had children and grandchildren and they attended their bar mitzvahs and bas mitzvahs. You can imagine if you survived a war and here you are celebrating and enjoying that with all your family.
Right.
You know, those events are so meaningful in a family life cycle anyway. But when you layer on top of that this unique sui generis experience of the Holocaust, it brings so much more meaning to what each of those family events represents, you know?
Yes, exactly.
Steve, tell us about Shanghai.
So, well, my family, I said, was almost literally the last train out of Germany. It left in April of 1940. And it wasn't long afterwards that you weren't getting out of Germany. And it's a very interesting story. My father did an interview with the Shoah Society with Steven Spielberg.
Yeah.
And he actually details their trip to Shanghai and life in Shanghai. But the trip to Shanghai is actually very eventful and interesting. They took a train to the Russian border and then went into Moscow for a few days, where they had a layover before the Siberian Express came, and only left twice a week. And they got to stay at the luxury hotel in Moscow, which would be about a 1-star hotel now. And I got to see Lenin's tomb. In fact, they were in line to see Lenin. And the soldiers there noticed they were a little different and asked them. They said, "Oh yeah, we're from Germany, and we're just passing through." Well, they were like royalty. Okay, so they were brought to the head of the line to see Lenin's tomb, and then the irony of ironies is the German government had to pay for their stay in Russia because they had to stay over a few days to catch the train.
Wow.
And then the train trip took a few days, and that was eventful too. But once they got to Shanghai, they spent a year in a refugee camp, basically displaced persons camp, before finding a home. And then when the war started with the United States, then the Shanghai ghetto part was actually made. The Jews were moved into a small area of Shanghai. Before that, they lived essentially in the same area of the city, but they were more scattered. Okay, but they were moved into a very small area. And like other ghettos where Rita and Elizabeth's family lived, it was small, a lot of disease, a lot of hunger. And my family had a hard time, getting enough food. My father worked, and my uncle Werner, my father's older brother, worked as a translator. He actually taught English, of all things, in China. And so they brought home a little bit of money. Were able to, at least get by. My father caught dysentery while he was there, almost died. But in 1947, they finally got the correct papers, and they sailed for San Francisco. An interesting story is when the family was still in Germany, they knew they had family in Peoria, Illinois. And so they sent a letter to this family because you needed a sponsor in order to come.
Right. And
they asked this family to sponsor them, and they heard nothing. So they figured, well, maybe they just couldn't sponsor us, maybe it just wasn't going to work. So they ended up in Shanghai. And so in 1947, my father convinced my uncle to go ahead and write a letter again to the same family. And this time they responded and said, yeah, come on over. And so they sailed for San Francisco, made their way to Peoria. What had happened earlier in 1939, 1940, the original letter was the letter was never delivered by the U.S. government. So this family, who they weren't wealthy, but they could sponsor my part of the family, never knew that there was family in need.
Wow.
So the second letter was finally delivered, and then they finally got here in 1947.
So your family's experience, like you said, Steve, very different from Elizabeth's and Rita's family.
Somewhat. And I did have, again, my uncle Kurt and then my grandfather, Sigmar Friedlander. They did spend some time, at least in a concentration camp. They weren't in a ghetto, but they were in a concentration camp.
Let me ask you something. I want you to define the word Holocaust, the term Holocaust survivor.
You mean first generation?
I just want you to, yeah.
Because there's a difference, okay? Because Elizabeth, Rita, and I are different than our parents. A Holocaust survivor is someone who made it out alive from the Holocaust.
Thank you. Okay. Put a pin in that. Elizabeth, unmute. What defines Holocaust survivor?
I agree with Stephen. I think it's living through the Holocaust.
Okay. Rita.
I think that is a topic that has gone several ways, because some people say you have to have survived from a camp, right, to be a survivor, while others were hiding, and every day was major, and how am I going to get to the next day? But I think Steve kind of wrapped it up to just say, if you survived, if you lived after the war, no matter what the conditions or the circumstances, that's a survivor.
I am so glad you mentioned that, Rita, because you're right. And I don't think people realize that there is a lot of debate on defining this term. So if we have to debate what a survivor is, and then you get into the children of survivors, how do they look at themselves depending on their parent's story? And, the parent may feel they are not a survivor. The child may feel they are. And the definitions and the identity can fluctuate throughout a person's life. It is incredibly complicated, yet this is indeed another manifestation and an effect of the Holocaust that you, the second gen, have inherited. Regardless of how it is defined, you are saddled with wrestling what that definition will look like for the next generation. Chase, I believe you had a question.
Yeah, I want to say thank you for joining us today and sharing the story, these stories and how you grew up. My question is, what do you think are the best tools that we have to combat Holocaust denial, which is rampant right now? How do you see your lived experiences of living with Holocaust survivors as a tool to help combat Holocaust denial?
Steve, why don't you take it and then we'll go to Elizabeth.
Well, we got to retell the stories. We have to present evidence that it was there. The Shoah Society has 52,000 hours of interviews, so there's a lot of evidence there. There's pictures, there's film, and educate youngsters. That's something that Herc does very well. Herc teaches the teachers, but then the teachers get to the young kids. I teach over at Childs High School. In the last several years, we've had a Holocaust Remembrance Week, and I've been on that committee since it started, and I've done several presentations to the student body, and that's a way. You just got to present. You got to present evidence. It has to be in a logical, emotional but unemotional way, and so you have to appeal to people's intelligence and say, hey, this is what happened. Here's the evidence. We had a Holocaust survivor speak at Childs a few years ago, and it made an impact. I was in the cafeteria where you had hundreds of teenagers and you could hear a pin drop. And that doesn't happen often with teenagers. My father spoke I taught at Rickards in the International Baccalaureate program. He talked to the IB students. When I transferred to Childs, he talked to their students. And when he spoke, again, you could hear a pin drop. And the questions the kids asked were fantastic. Okay, very, very good questions. And so that's the kind of thing we're going to have to do. Elizabeth and Rita and myself and, Barbara, second generation survivors, we got to carry the torch. And because even the Holocaust survivors, first generation, they're getting too old to go out their dog. And so we're going to have to carry on the torch and just keep presenting, and just reach as many people as we can.
Thanks, Steve. Elizabeth, please add to that, and then we'll go to Rita.
Yes. When my father passed away and I was cleaning out his house, I got a lot of documentations of when he came to this country and what happened and how he came to this country. And one of the things that happened when they left the DP camp, they had to get, or come into this country, they had to get a paper called the Certification of Identity in lieu of passport. Mm-hmm. Now, on this piece of paper, it says there's a single journey only. In other words, he's coming to this country, not leaving the country. And it says that he solemnly declares that he never committed nor has been convicted of any crime except as follows. And this is what the part that was typed in. My internment, meaning at the DP camp, was due to racial persecution and not because of any crime. And I believe because racial persecution still happens today on many different levels, not just Jews. So I think by education and by relating that the Jews went through racial persecution, just like this other group of people that is going through racial persecution right now, so that it could be relatable. And I think because the Holocaust happened such a long time ago, and that generation is dying out, it's not relatable. As a teacher, I actually had adult students tell me that people did not even go to the moon. They didn't believe that somebody landed on the moon, and that was all done in a studio. and it's all fake. So you're going to have the naysayers, but education is the most important thing, and to make it relatable so that it hits home for them. I think that's what's really important.
Thank you. Learning from teachers. I love it. Rita.
To continue with that, learning from teachers, education is, I think, the key for the students growing up. Herc does a wonderful job. Barbara and I think we knew each other a little bit, but starting from way back from about 2006, we were both going to classrooms, telling our stories, and then we teamed up and told the students got to hear different stories of 4 different people. And Herc has just made a tremendous impact in our community. When I was going to school, I don't remember learning anything about the Holocaust, even in high school, very, very little. And there's so much documentation now of survivors' stories. There are so many films and books, and we just have to keep sharing all of that with the younger students so that when they are adults, that hopefully we will have a better world where people are not denying the Holocaust.
Well, I want to thank you all for our way too short time to be together for these incredibly important messages. And I just want to wrap with a few keywords that you all said, so people can know they can do something to help carry on your family stories. And you've all said it. It starts with education. And we have Herc right here that provides that to anyone who wants to reach out, whether they're in Tallahassee or Timbuktu. Barbara can make that happen. I've seen her do it. And so I know she can do it. The other thing that Steve said, which is so important, is you've got to have facts. We can't deny the emotion. The emotion obviously is there. We are human beings, but we have to have facts because, like you also mentioned, there is denial. And denial is based in fear and ignorance. And the only way to combat that is to deconstruct the illogical house of cards that is there. And once you have facts, that's all there is. I think Deborah Lipstadt said it best, right? There are facts, there are opinions, and there are lies. And facts, as long as you have those, the lies melt away, because that you can't have both at the same time, right? And you all are living proof of history and fact. And I'm just so grateful for your time today. I know it's important that we hear these stories and that we remember them. So the story of how Elizabeth saw her father's numbers as a little girl rolling out the dough as he was a baker, how Rita remembers how both her parents showed resilience and carried on, whether it was silently or whether it was through their actions and their religious observance. And Stephen's incredible story of crossing continents in order to survive. These are our stories that everyone today, we all inherit by virtue of being here with you. So I want to thank Rita, Elizabeth, Steve, and of course, Chase, Herc, and Barbara. I'll give it to you to wrap. Please unmute.
Got it. Okay, once again, I want to thank everybody for helping be here today. This was incredible. I know also from personal experience, these stories have to be told, and they really do make a difference. So we're going to again wrap it up today and then come back next week for a new program. We'll be doing this again next week. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Okay.